Welcome to the Atheist Experience. We're broadcasting live Sunday, September 17th, and I'm your host, Tracie Harris. With me this week is our special guest, Mitchell Diamond, who is author of Darwin's Apple, The Evolutionary Biology of Religion, and also our ACA bonus lecturer for today on the biology of hallucinations. So welcome, Mitchell.
Thank you.
We have a little bit of issues with our phone today, so I'm just going to let people know. We have a studio that is working very hard to stabilize our phones, but currently we are unable to communicate with the callers. So just a heads up that the plan right now is that we will go ahead and start with our discussion with Mitchell, and then we will proceed to phones if we can get that stabilized. In the meantime, I will be able to sort of offhand monitor chat now and then, and if we get questions that would be relevant to the show today or to Mitchell's topic, we may go ahead and just take some of those questions. We'll have to see how that works out. Just to go on with the announcements, the Atheist Experience is sponsored by the Atheist Community of Austin, which is a Texas nonprofit educational organization that is dedicated to the separation of church and state and promoting positive atheist culture. You can catch us live every Sunday on YouTube or Ustream and comment on current shows at the current show thread supplied for each episode at our blog at freethoughtblogs.com/AXP. You can add comments on YouTube while the show is running, and additionally, you can write to the show at tv@atheist-community.org, or you can join the Atheist Experience official discussion group on Facebook. If you enjoy this show, you may also enjoy other ACA podcasts, The Nonprofits, which airs on the first and third Wednesday nights of each month. Links are available at the Atheist Experience website. After the show, the cast and crew will go out to dinner at Star of India restaurant at 2900 West Anderson Lane. We arrive a little after 6 p.m., and dinner is a social event open to atheists and atheist-friendly people. Our ACA Bat Cruise is next weekend on September 23rd. The same weekend, we're having god-awful movies coming to Austin. So you can come out and make it an atheist weekend. God-awful movies is going to be on Friday, September 22nd. The pre-cruise lecture happens at 2 p.m. the following day on the 23rd, and then we meet for the cruise that evening on the 23rd. Then I just also wanted to, before I wrap up the announcements, give a little bit of a shout out to all of our fans who helped us with the Hurricane Harvey effort. We did do matching donations, and I asked before the show where we were at. They said we were about at $3,600 in funds raised, including the matching funds. So yay, we're getting some applause for that. And that's applause for the people that contributed. Yes, it was great that ACA was able to match some of those donations, but I also think that it's great that you all stepped up and made that happen. So thank you for your help with that, and thank you for helping the hurricane relief effort. I think that's everything that I have. And so I guess, Mitchell, we had your lecture a little bit earlier today, and I caught most of that. I think I missed the first part of it, but I did want to kind of let you do a little bit of intro. If you could just talk for as long as you're comfortable about what got you kind of interested in this, and what is your background with it?
Well, it started when I was a teenager, and someone gave me a copy of gosh, I can't remember the book. Anyway, but it basically told me that the human animal was an animal, because up to that point, I'd been led to believe that we were special in the animal kingdom. We were different. And Desmond Morris, The Naked Ape, thank you. Just took me a second to pull that out. And so what his point is that we were far more like animals than not. And that actually turned me around on a lot of things. Because when I was growing up, there was the Vietnam War, and the nuclear issues were very prevalent at that time. And I'm thinking, there's really something wrong with people.
Okay.
You know, and but I was, you know, after that book, I started reading more and more, and I became convinced that biology was the way to go. So I went to, I got my biology degree, my 4-year degree, and then I went off and did other things. I did not particularly follow that path, but I was always very interested in it, and I continued to think about it. And then some years ago, actually it was Bill Moyers when he interviewed Joseph Campbell.
Oh yeah.
And that was in the late 80s, and talking about mythology, the power of myth, it was called. And I thought, you know, this is all about religion, really. This is the basis for a lot of religious belief. and Joseph Campbell, if you're familiar with the way he talks, it's very entertaining, but I didn't really understand a lot of what he was talking about. At least it didn't make sense scientifically. So I thought to myself, I think I want to look into this a little bit. And I started reading about the theories of religion from a biological or scientific point of view, and it was very clear that there was no agreement. And a number of people said there's really no agreed on theory for why people have religion. And so I started thinking about it, and then it was almost an epiphany. I hate to say it that way because it has some connotations we don't want to follow. But I had this idea, and I just kept pursuing it and expanding on it, and it turned into this book.
Well, I just want to say that I liked the way that you approached this, because at first when I started to read the book, because I did download this when I knew that you were coming on the show, and I did start to read it, and there was a part of me that started jumping all over the place to, well, but what about this? And well, what about that? And well, what about, because I was saying earlier, I have also, part of my degree was in anthropology and also in communication studies with psychology of communication, which deals with human communication development. And so as I was reading, I had a lot of kind of questions that were popping up, and I was writing them down. And then I went online when I realized that I wouldn't be able to make it through the book before we chatted. I went online and I watched your lecture. And most of everything that I was writing down, you addressed in the lecture. And you were like, okay, so we know that animals react in ways that sometimes show that they are interpreting agency in the world where there's none. It's not just people that do that, other animals do that. And that was kind of your point. Your point wasn't to separate people as something different. Your point was to say, we're so similar, and yet we have religion. And so why? Because all of these things that we keep hearing as propositions, why haven't other species encountered this or run into this? And so what you were proposing is that it has to do, if I'm understanding you right, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like there is some benefit to me giving you my interpretation of what you were saying so that you can correct it in case other people may have the same misinterpretations. But it sounds as though what you were saying is that where people, every species obviously has differences, otherwise we would all be the same species. So every species is a unique species in some way.
Right.
And with people, you seem to focus on the idea of cognition and like the extent of the cognition, that it's like, yes, we make tools and they make tools, but our tools go way beyond the tools that any other species is making. And we have these same sorts of ability to give agency to the world, but it goes way beyond a chimpanzee waving branches at a storm. And so what you were kind of saying is that maybe this has something to do with that aspect of people that is the one thing we know is really unique, that doesn't seem to be as mimicked as closely by other species. Is that a fair assessment of where you were starting with this?
I'd say you're on the right track. The approach has to be scientific, and that's what I decided it was going to be, which meant that a lot of the stuff about belief, which is a big part of religion, we're just not going to worry about that. We're going to put that aside for the time being. We're going to talk about scientifically observable things. So the first assumption is that we are more animal, as I said, than we are not. We're still have instincts. Our blood is red like other animals and all that. So if we're going to talk about how humans are different, we start with animals. And then we move, as you said, through what the changes are. So you said very well that pretty much everything about humans we find in other animals, and that's a relatively new thing. We used to think that humans were the only animals that made tools. We used to think that humans were the only animals that murdered, and we know that a lot of other animals murder their own kind. All those different things. About the only thing that I'm come up with is religion is the only thing that's unique. But in order to explain that, we have to look at the changes in human cognition, because religion is ultimately something that comes from the human brain. So we have to look at what happened between chimps or our primate ancestors, where we descended or divided from the chimps who became chimps, what changed in our brain. So the chimp's brain is, I'm guessing what is about 500 cc's, I forget exactly, and ours is about 1,400 cc's, so it's about 2.5 to 3 times larger than a chimp and gorilla. Well, that's a very significant difference. So, yes, there's a lot to talk about what those differences are, but that's sort of the assumption I made about how I'm going to approach this.
The other thing that you did that I thought was very interesting is the way that you kind of backed it up. So you looked at at current concepts that people had put forward as explanations for religion. And what you basically are saying is that this is not an explanation for religion, this is a function that religion may serve, but it doesn't really explain how this started.
That's right.
And it took me a while to kind of clue in to exactly what you were getting at with that, So at first I was thinking, because again, in anthropology, you study anthropology of religion, and so there were all these explanations for the functions of it. And you were saying, yes, but the functions of it are not the cause. The way it functions or how it serves does not explain how this arose to make these functions. How did it arise to serve these in these ways?
You did a great job of interpreting that, actually. A lot of people get bogged down and they don't quite see it that way. So yes, there's, to me, there's 3 basic explanations in existence right now for why we have religion. We can go into the details. Shall we do that?
Yes, please.
All right. Well, the first one is called byproduct theory, and this irks me no end. So people like Richard Dawkins and Steven Pinker and a lot of other people say religion is a byproduct of other evolved cognitions or changes in our cognitive brain. And so the examples that Dawkins gives, for instance, in God Delusion, is about the moth to the flame as an example of a byproduct. And he talks about how children are gullible to their parents and adults' direction in their culture. Well, that's all true, and those, if you want to call those byproducts, you're certainly free to, but those don't relate to religion. Let me give you a different example. Byproduct is certainly recognized when you talk about vestigial structures like the whale's pelvis.
Yeah, tailbone, human.
Yeah. So, but in the whale's pelvis, we believe whales evolved from land animals. And so when the whale, the cetaceans were land animals, they had a pelvis and it was adaptive and it helped them for locomotion. They went into the ocean over evolutionary time of millions of years. The pelvis became unnecessary, becomes vestigial, it's a byproduct. The point is, it was functional and adaptive when they were land animals. It wasn't always functionless. Another example, the belly button, the navel, right? So in utero, attached to the umbilical cord, it's obviously functional and adaptive, and then you're born and it falls off, and then you have this navel for the rest of your life that is functionless. But in your lifetime, it was functional at one point.
Sure.
So we have 2 examples where it was functional either in evolutionary time or in a lifetime, and then becomes functionless. That's fine. What Dawkins and Pinker and the others are saying is that religion was never functional. There was never a reason for religion. It's always been functionless. They don't have a model in any other biology to say that.
Right.
And they make all kinds of efforts, as like the moth and the flame thing, but those are just not relevant. It's a lot of hand waving and smoke and mirrors. They're trying to make this case. My favorite Dawkins quote is from God Delusion, and he says, if I can remember it, Darwinian selection habitually targets and eliminates waste. Nature is a miserly accountant, grudging the pennies, watching the clock, punishing the smallest extravagance. Punishing the smallest extravagance.
Yeah, religion would be a huge extravagance.
It's a huge extravagance.
I agree.
So Richard, I'm talking to you. Tell us, is it that evolution punishes the smallest extravagance, or is religion, which is a very expensive in evolutionary terms set of behaviors and features, is that a byproduct? Doesn't make sense.
Now we should be sure, because people watching are not going to understand this, but you make a very, first of all, in your book you make you take great pains to talk about consciousness and the model of consciousness that you are leaning toward.
Yes.
Because you acknowledge that there are many debates and many perspectives on consciousness that can be used.
That's
and so
right.
you do make an effort to say, here's what I'm selecting as my model and why. And then you also go into, gosh, I've lost my train of thought. There was that, and then there was something else, and I'll have to just kind of get back to it if I can remember what
All right,
I was
well, we
heading.
can talk about the consciousness
But there was something about, religion, because you were talking about religion. People watching are going to have a very, very different ideas about what that means, and you have an actual definition that you use for that, or at least a model that you use for that.
A model. Let's call it a model.
Sure, okay.
So the problem with consciousness, it's like religion. There's a lot of definitions for it. And so I gave some examples in the book just barely to set a baseline. You know, people like Antonio Damasio talks about it. And Gerald Edelman wrote a book about consciousness. And so they all have their versions, and there's lots of other people who have their versions. And you're sort of at the end of it, I mean, not only is it difficult to deal with these various versions, but ultimately, like religion, no one has a good answer of what consciousness is. So instead of trying to define it, I simply say, let's talk about what we think are the features of consciousness. It's our big memory. It's our decision-making and choices. It's our short-term memory, where we can pull in experiences of our own lifetime. I mean, that's one of the things that's the most important feature of, well, there's a lot of important features, but one of them is that humans are capable of handling conditional information, contingent information based on their location, based on their environment. So for most animals, they live in a relatively narrow niche in their ecosystem. And then if the area changes too much, they could be in trouble because they can't change. They're instinctually based. So if the environment changes, they're stuck. Instinctual changes take evolutionary time to solve.
Sure.
And but whereas humans, we have culture. This ability to have contingent or conditional information allows us to have culture. We learn within our lifetime and can pass that learning to our progeny. So now we have these capabilities, which are, again, close to unique. Obviously, a lot of other animals are tool users and can pass that cultural information to their progeny. But as you pointed out, it's magnitudes of order larger that we can do this than other animals can. But there's a consequence to this capability. So I'm diving into the problems with consciousness a little bit here. A lot of people talk about the fact that we have existential anxieties. And this is one of the reasons that people give for why we have religion. Why do we die? What's our purpose in life? Why are there hurricanes and volcanoes and earthquakes? And how did we get stories from the gods handed down by the spider?
How do I react or handle a plague?
Yeah. We have these questions. And so, first of all, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say, no other animal asks, why am I going to die? Or worried about their death a year from now. They're always concerned about staying safe and not being somebody's lunch in the near term. But that's very different than projecting out into far away time about their death. So this is something that's unique to humans.
Yeah.
But at the same time, this ability we have to think about these things means that we also worry and we have anxieties, the existential anxieties, and ask these questions, and it becomes an issue for people.
Sure.
And the other part of this consciousness is that we have a lot of choices. We have too many choices.
Yeah, there's a lot.
And so there's a number of books, for example, Barry Schwartz, The Paradox of Choice, and Sheena Iyengar, The Art of Choosing, and there's a very popular guy whose name escapes me, but he studies it from an economic point of view.
Okay.
And he writes about how we basically make choices in unconscious ways most of the time.
Right.
But the point is, consciousness does not give us the tools to make these choices, really. Consciousness is mostly sitting on top of unconscious processes.
Sure.
So people like Michael Gazzaniga, a neuroscientist in California, and there's some other people who say the same thing, which is that high into the 90 percentile, our behavior is unconscious. Very little of our actual behavior and thinking process is based on actual consciousness, whatever that means, and we haven't defined it.
Right.
And as well, it's not only that that consciousness isn't actually that much of an effect on us, it also brings problems. It brings downsides. It's these very questions of why we die and our purpose in life, and all these things create anxieties. So Carl Jung, many, many years ago, talked about this, where he said, animals come from instinct. That's what drives their behavior. They don't think. They don't have to make decisions. Every decision for them is automatic. The gift of consciousness, he said, is fear and anxiety and all those things that go around in our head. And that gift of consciousness is a problem. And we live with that. That's the human condition. And if I may, while I'm on the subject,
Sure.
and hawk my book.
Please do.
The cover is a very unsubtle.
They're showing it, actually.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
So it looks like
You're
it's
good.
up. There's the
There's
book
Chuck,
right there.
Chuck Darwin, my buddy, getting the apple from a female of some indeterminate, not pre-human genus. And but obviously the Garden of Eden. And so in my first chapter, I discussed the parable of the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is a metaphor. And this is Joseph Campbell talks about metaphor. He says, all this religious stuff that these people are taking literally, it's not literal. They're metaphors.
Right.
They come out of our brains. So in the Garden of Eden, before all the bad stuff happened, it was a place of innocence. Perfection, perhaps. Everybody got along. It's a metaphor for pre-human consciousness. Before we had all these choices to make, before we had godlike knowledge, and everything was good. But then we ate the apple from the tree of knowledge. From the tree of knowledge is a metaphor for acquiring higher consciousness, the consciousness that we're talking about, the human consciousness. And when that happened, it hit the fan. And we got booted out because now we had consciousness. And it's a metaphor for the fact that this consciousness is as much of a problem, perhaps more of a problem for us than a benefit. Now, I've talked down on consciousness a lot. It's obviously a benefit.
Don't be hating consciousness.
Well, keep it in a balance. So the fact is, consciousness is obviously beneficial for humanity, because if it wasn't, it wouldn't continue to exist. Natural selection picks off the people, the animals, the organisms that don't cut it. And they don't cut it for a lot of reasons. But we've had this consciousness for, well, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years. So, and it continues. And look what we've done. We've built this civilization that's frankly amazing. And we can stream this on the internet, and we can have skyscrapers and send things into space, and it's remarkable. And consciousness was certainly a big contributor to that. And we have the same behaviors that people have been doing for tens of thousands of years. We keep killing ourselves. We keep fighting with each other. We can't.
But
really...
we're aware of it now.
Yay! Well, actually, that makes it worse, I suppose.
I'm sorry, I derailed your train of thought. I did not mean to do that.
That's all right.
I apologize.
Yeah, so...
We've had this consciousness that's been going on, and then we still have these wars, and we still do all these things.
So the ability to look into the future. It's interesting because here we are, there's this so-called debate about climate change, right? It's pretty clear, I think it's safe to say on this podcast, that climate change is a fact. And yet it continues to be a struggle to deal with for any number of reasons, many of them political, as well as technological and scientific. But the fact that it's a struggle politically just shows how difficult it is to deal with people's consciousness and their perceptions and their biases and their prejudices. We still have all these prejudices. We still have these cognitive biases. So there's a chapter in here about cognitive biases. See, I can go on and on. You got to cut me off. I'm getting out of control.
Until I hear we have phone stabilization, I think you're free to talk.
Cognitive biases. So a lot of research has been done in the past 50 years or so that cognitive biases are primarily what drives us, heuristics. So, for example, there's a fellow named Daniel Kahneman, who has a book about fast thinking, slow thinking right now. But he developed his chops, as it were, with his buddy Tversky, whatever his first name was. Kahneman and Tversky back in the 70s were doing their early research where they basically developed their theories about how people don't, they're not rational creatures. Consciousness is not the thing that controls you in your day-to-day behavior. It's primarily heuristics, habits of thought, the way we've been conditioned, and these cognitive biases. So now you can go on Wikipedia and you'll see there's about 180 or 200 different cognitive biases. So when you start adding all these things up, you realize that nothing is the way it seems. Because people in their day-to-day life think that their consciousness is what gets them to make their decisions, which helps them to decide moment to moment what my actions are going to be. And it turns out it's not that way.
Right.
When you look at the science of of brain cognition, of human cognition. It's these biases, it's emotions, a lot of emotions. Everything that we do is colored by emotion, which is a good thing, I guess. I mean, the fact is, humans have been fabulously successful in evolutionary terms. We have taken over, essentially, or at least populated almost every aspect of the globe except Antarctica. Even though there's a few science stations there, we're not going to count that. And the fact that they can modify their behavior for every different environment that they find, it's really quite a remarkable achievement.
It is.
But there's still this crazy brain that we have that causes all these problems. Now, I speak about this in terms of modern times, because we're modern, obviously, because if we weren't, we wouldn't be here. But in terms of evolution of humans, especially in terms of evolution of religion, they think religion started anywhere from 40,000 to 100,000 years or more ago. And so for 95, 97% of humanity, we've lived in hunter-gatherer tribal groups. That's when religion evolved. That's how we have to think about it. So when we talk about all this stuff in terms of what we are now, that's fine, but if you really want to understand religion and where it came from and why we have it, it's what it's like living in a tribal group of 25 to 100 to 150 people.
Okay.
They all know each other. They all live in a tribe where they acquire their language, obviously, from that culture, but they also acquire their ideas. Of course, this is what Dawkins talks about when he beats up on religion, saying it's a byproduct because the children learn from their parents these crazy ideas about religion and mythology. But there's a problem with that idea, at least maybe someone, if we ever get connected, can help me out with. So in God Delusion, Richard says, when he's arguing against the existence of God, which is fine, no problem with that. He says, who designed the designer? That's a good argument for against the existence of God. Later in the book, he's talking about this business of how children are gullible and they naturally adopt the mores and the customs of their parents, which is reasonable, but then they adopt the mores and customs of the mythology as well and pass it along. But to me, the question is, well, did these mores, this religious mythology, just drop down from the sky? Who designed the designer when it comes to religion? Richard. So this idea that it's just passed along as a meme doesn't wash. It comes from somewhere.
Right, and I think that was the question that you were trying to get at was, okay, but what was the cause? What triggered this?
Right.
And not, how does it propagate or what, you're not interested in what it's doing as much as, but where did it come from?
That's right.
And you're looking for the biological explanation for this because you believe that's where this answer should lie. Mm-hmm. And the other thing that I want to make sure we get to, now that we've talked a little bit about your thoughts on consciousness, is your idea of religion and what you're calling religion.
Right. So again, as I mentioned, religion can mean many things to many people. I want to look at it at the individual level, because that's where the biology is. Of course, religion is institutional. Mm-hmm. It's churches. It's these theistic religions. It's a lot of things.
Right. It's got a cultural and social aspect, but what you're saying is that if I want to know what it is to the animal,
that's right,
then I need to look at the animal.
Correct. So what is it at the individual level? And this is where we're going to get into basically what my thesis is. So we already said consciousness creates problems. And that one of the ways we deal with the noise in our head that consciousness creates is through behaviors that quiet consciousness. And that's sort of the thing that struck me. That sort of came out of the blue to me. So the thesis is 10 words. Intrinsic religion is a compensating mechanism for higher order consciousness. Intrinsic religion is a compensating mechanism for higher order consciousness. Once you accept that consciousness has a downside, drawbacks, then there's a reason that you need to deal with that. You need to quiet it. So what religion does, the personal experience of religion, not that institutional stuff, but the personal experience of religion, the practice of religion, quiets consciousness temporarily. It shuts down, shut down perhaps a little strong, but it inhibits or suppresses noisy consciousness. That's what it does. And that's what it did as it evolved 100,000 years ago. Is there evidence of that? Not at the time. There's only evidence of what we have today. We can observe that, in fact, this is what happens. So it not only suppresses or inhibits consciousness, it stimulates emotions, typically.
Right.
So, hold that thought.
Okay, if it's all right, we did a program at one point where I took comments that were stripped from a website that features drug experiences.
Yes.
Literally, people are going out experimenting with drugs, and then they are logging those experiences on this website as a group. And they put down, very specific information. Here's what I took. Here's what I took with it. Here's how long. Here's when I started taking this. And then they go through it. Here's how much I weigh. Here's how old I am.
Trying to make some science out of it.
And well, it's a strange thing. It's like a little group, social experiment that people are putting together that relies on, I guess, the recording of people who are trying to give information on things while they're in these altered states. Now, and they will explain their experience as well, whether it was positive for them, negative for them. But the thing that caught my attention was a lot of the phrases that are on this website when people are talking about their experience while they're in the experience are very similar to people who call the show to talk about their religious experience. And you were showing Jay at the lectures, I guess it was kind of a people it almost looked like Yanomami culture. I don't know if that's who it was.
Yes, it was Yanomami.
And so I walked in sort of in the middle of it, but they were, taking the drugs in order to hit that spot where you interact with the other side, where you're literally going in and reaching out to the spiritual aspect of what they believe is like a spiritual plane with the spirit animals, and where they have all these other agents and things that you can get in contact with beyond yourself, and where you can actually move yourself into that plane. And so you have these weird experiences, and what you were talking about is the person taking on the persona of the spirit animal, and how this is the person now becoming more animalistic, and he was mimicking the animal and doing this ritual. And there are, of course, other religions that would be, and it's hard to use a word that would describe it, but if a person were to see this who had never seen it before, it's a very politically incorrect label, but I'm going to say it would look rather primitive.
Yes.
And so it wouldn't look at all like what you would expect. There's not a church cathedral. There's not it's literally people who are mostly naked, squatting on the ground with a pot of this drug mixture and shooting it up their noses and having these bizarre experiences.
That's right.
And so then you have the idea of something like a Buddhist practice or even Hindu practice where yoga and the idea of quieting the mind and expelling the thought. And this whole concept, it's like you're saying, there's so much emphasis. And while I was reading your book, I kept trying to think, what would be examples of religions that didn't do this, religions that didn't, what would be the counterexample of something that doesn't do this? But there is, even when we get the callers, like especially with the Catholics, they have these, transcendent experience. And you have the Catholic statuary with the expressions, for example, of the ecstatic experience, where somebody's being like shot through the heart with an arrow from an angel, or, so you've got this whole thing, like you're saying, that goes to an emotional level, where they're going for a non-conscious experience. And so I understood what you were describing. The only thing I could even grasp for was the like extremely aesthetic religions, where they expel or reject anything that would be what they would consider a distraction, like anything beautiful, music or art or any of that. There are some religions where they are just very, very
Spartan.
Yes. And I'm not sure, though, I don't really know enough about that to understand, what would be whether they have these ideas of an ecstatic experience.
It's hard to know, and not everybody has ecstatic experiences. The experience of religion is a spectrum, like so many things. People go to church and they don't have ecstatic experiences. They just,
right.
Do the Mass and. They do it every Sunday, and it's just.
But
routine.
we do get a lot of calls from people talking about the feeling. I have these feelings. I have this feeling, and I just feel it's so emotionally driven.
Yes, and so clearly it goes all the way across the spectrum to the other end, where people have full-on mystical experiences, but again, trying to wrap my head around what is unique or what is consistent across all these things. It's about emotion, and it's about suppressing consciousness. And even at the moderate end, where they're not having the big emotional reaction, and they're just going to church, they're praying, they're reading the book,
right.
And it's a little bit of a ritual, and that ritual helps them to get out of their day-to-day head.
Yeah, they do, and I thought of that because you did describe both prayer and singing, and I think even in the churches where you would never find a stained glass window or a statue, you will generally still have songs, like psalms or hymns, and then you would also still have prayer.
Right.
Yeah.
So a big part of my book is the rituals. And so I focus on the rituals. The rituals that I focus on are music, dance, art, mythology, and prayer meditation. And there's lots of rituals, and the reason I choose those rituals for a couple of reasons. First of all, when you look at those, they don't have any obvious purpose that we think of in terms of evolution. They're not getting you food, they're not building a shelter, they're not defending the group. They're seemingly done for no good reason at all that we can obviously see.
Yeah, like you say, from the individual level, where is this helping you?
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And also, when you see them, you pretty much know. They're observable, ethologically. So ethology is the study of animal behavior. Jane Goodall is a famous ethologist. Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen, for those who in biology know, that were the couple of founders back in the 30s of ethology. So I want to look at the behavior of religion ethologically. What are the actions, not what the beliefs are. The beliefs will just go down a rabbit hole and you just get drowned there, and it's a bad thing. You look at the actions, and those all have actions, more or less. I mean, some more than others, but certainly music and dance. You know when people are performing the music and the dance, or listening. Even listening counts. Appreciating the music. We all get, pretty much, it's human nature to like music. And we all have the music, special music that we like. And music, more than any other ritual, is known to elicit emotions. There's lots of scientific literature describing the fact that music elicits emotions, and there's lots of work that they know this is the case in various aspects of that. So, so those rituals I talk about in the book, but what do they all do? They all end up at some level suppressing consciousness. Some more than others, some different situations than others. You know, nowadays you plug into your ears and you're listening to music all day, and it's hard to imagine that your emotions are moving all that much because of the music you're listening to while you're washing the dishes and the laundry and all that other stuff. But we like it. We do it because we enjoy music. There's an emotional thing going on there, even if it's not really intense at that moment. But other
it gets
times
intense. People will argue, right? Like, I love that song. I hate that song.
There's no doubt that it gets intense.
People love their music.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
They put a lot of emotional energy into it. Absolutely. And certainly there's instances where music can cause a very strong emotional reaction, aside from people arguing about what country.
Sure.
Country, you know, that old thing about. I have two kinds of music I like: country and western.
Right.
That silly joke. But you know,
it sailed right over my head until you said that.
Oh, okay. So in today's culture, there's raves, for example, where people dance for hours and hours and hours, and they're also taking drugs in some cases.
A little bit of ecstasy.
Yeah, there's that too. But they, whether or not they take the drugs, it's certainly feasible to achieve an altered state of consciousness, which suppresses, well, it's just a way of saying that it changes your normal consciousness, but it inhibits or suppresses our typical consciousness. That's in this culture. But of course, once you start looking at tribal or traditional cultures, there's all kinds of ways they do this. And as we talked about with the Yanomamo, they have a specific combination of plants that they extract, and they put it in their nose, and then they go off and they meet their spirit ally. But there's a lot of that are not necessarily related to drug use. Typically, these kinds of rituals that can cause changes in your consciousness are various deprivations. We talked a little about with the dancing. If you reach exhaustion or create stress for yourself, in a lot of cases, or sensory deprivation is a good one.
I have a question.
Yes.
And it may not be a well thought out question. I like to think about my questions more than this, but it just came into my head and I thought, let me ask it, and if it's kind of goofy, you'll let me know.
Mm-hmm.
How would, while you're talking about the idea of suppressing the conscious level, the conscious layer of thinking, of thought, which I guess it's kind of a redundancy, conscious thought, but is that also, do you also interpret that as moving it aside to give voice to a non-conscious level?
Sure.
And so how would something like dreams weave into this?
That is an excellent question, and one I am not prepared to answer.
Okay. Well, I feel good that it's a good question.
Good. First of all, we can at least talk about what we know. We are pretty sure animals have dreams.
Yeah, and I did read that as part of when I was looking into your book. I was like, do they dream? What do they? Yeah.
Well, I have a dog.
Yeah.
Who frequently, while sleeping, the legs start going like this.
Right.
And she's running, presumably, in her dreams.
Well, there are studies that show that they experience the same sorts of REM cycles that we do that produce dreams. And not all dreams happen in REM, but they were saying that most of the dreams you remember happen in REM, and dogs have REM.
Yep. And
other animals, I'd have to look it up again. I was doing a lot of reading, but I think they actually said even like rats experience REM. And that they would guess that they're simply having dreams that would be very mundane about their regular activities. They were like, it's hard to say what they're dreaming, but they're experiencing something.
Right. So we're talking the biology of dreams across species, and I don't think scientists really know.
Well, one of the things that's always fascinated me, and don't let me derail you. Like, if you think this is too much of a sideline, we can
come
ditch
back.
this. But one of the things that's always surprised me or been interesting to me, I guess, about dreams is the aspect of surprise in a dream. So my brain is producing the dream, and yet I don't know what's going to happen. Right? And so it's like, here's this dream that is like a production of my own mind. And I'm aware of it. I'm in the experience. I'm consciously in that experience. Well, and that's another, is that consciously in the dream? Because I've also experimented a little bit with lucid dreaming. And that's a different level of consciousness within the dream. That's where you're actually aware that you're dreaming, and you're in bed, and you're in the dream, and you're experiencing a dream, and you know that this is a dream, that you're wandering around in.
Have you felt that you've actually achieved lucid dreaming?
I have, yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and it's difficult for me. Some people do it more easily.
Better than others.
I have to sit there and work for months to do all the little quirky things. And then finally I will wake up and say, oh my gosh, let me look at my hands. They're not right. This is a dream. And then you kind of, my goal is always to find people to talk to, and I never can. So I always fail at my goal, which is that I would like to talk to some of the people I'm creating and manufacturing in the dream. And this is kind of where my head is at with it, and I don't know that this is correct, but I see it as an opportunity for my conscious mind to actually have a conversation with my non-conscious mind.
Okay, well, I don't know what to say about that.
I don't really either. It's just something that I think, like, it's like I would have to be honest and say this is what interests me about lucid dreaming, is that producing that character, it's not my conscious self.
Right.
And so I don't know where that character is coming from, but I trust that it's my own brain that produced it. So whatever it says, I'm not consciously controlling it. And so it's got to be coming from some aspect of me that is not under conscious control.
Well, that's
and
right.
I would like to have a conversation with that part of my head.
Well, I would go as only to say that, given what you said about most of this is generated from the unconscious, and dreams are clearly multi-species, pan-species, that there's a reason that has to do with, that doesn't have so much to do with consciousness per se. I suspect it just has to do with the fact that we're bombarded with tactile or sensory information every day. A lot of memories are created supposedly during sleep, right?
Yeah.
So it's just trying to catch up. I mean, that's sort of the high level.
I often incorporate things that happen in my day.
Yes.
Like, I'll have a dream and I'll be like, oh, because I just talked to so-and-so about that 2 days ago, and so that's why I dreamed it. And so I definitely understand I don't attribute any kind of mysticism to the dream.
No.
But at the same time, a lot of people do.
Yes.
And this becomes part of that religious ritual that you speak of, because people attribute a lot of mystical weight to dreams, especially in cultures where they don't have more of a scientific understanding of a dream, where they see it as more, I don't know where these visions are coming from at night. But I was there, and I met these people, or I met these things, or I was a frog, and I was. And there's all these weird things that happen in your dream that are very surreal. They don't conform to the same structures and consistency that we see in our reality during the waking time, right? Like, a dream can be completely wild.
That's right.
And you come out of it and you're like, okay, at the time I was in the dream, it was making perfect sense, but now it's completely weird.
Yeah.
And I was completely unaware of that, buying into the entire thing lock, stock, and barrel while I was in the dream. And so some people actually, and even with modern concepts of dreams, we still have people in the modern age who are educated who believe that they are, for example, astral projecting and
Yes.
Things like this. Maybe it's not quite what you're talking about, I don't know, but it's an example of us again focusing on the subdued conscious section of existence and saying there is some mystical power there. There's something there to focus on that is important to us in a religious context.
Okay, well, we'll move a little bit away from dreaming and take that. So people do have both dream and non-dream experiences, astral projecting, or some of the other so-called mystical or spiritual experiences where they feel it's almost we would call it hallucinatory, perhaps. And I tie that, at least in some aspects of it, back to this thing called theory of mind. The idea of the theory of mind is that we evolved to be able to think about what other people are thinking.
Sure.
And this is a fairly common idea that's in the scientific and psychological literature. But what's critical is how we got to achieve that. And this gets back to the evolution of human cognition. How is it that we got to achieve that? There's probably evidence that other animals have somewhat of a theory of mind.
Sure, they try to deceive, for example, in some research. Yeah,
that's right. So in order to have a theory of mind, in order to think about what somebody else is thinking, you have to be very cognizant of yourself as a separate entity than the other. And so we know chimps and gorillas and probably some cetaceans and maybe even rats, you know, we're only limited by the amount of science that we can do on this stuff. They all have self-knowledge. So certainly for the chimps and gorillas, they can look in a mirror and they know it's themselves.
Right. Got the dot.
Unlike, say, a cat, exactly, that's how they do it. They put a dot on the forehead or somewhere, and the animal sees it, and they go like this. That says that they know how...
That's me in the mirror.
That's me in the mirror. Probably there's a lot more animals that could do that, maybe, but for, you know, because of the limitations of the animals, morphology and science and all this, we just don't know. But the point is, it exists. We have it far more. Again, another one of these orders of magnitude situations compared to other animals. So that change in order of magnitude along our cognitive evolution created a situation where we really know self versus non-self. But once you assume that situation is the case, then you can project ideas that you have. You have an idea that someone else has a thought.
Yeah.
But that means you can project all kinds of stuff out there. You create the world out there based on the things you think are happening.
Right, some of which are going to be real and some of which aren't.
Yes.
Yeah.
Some of them are gods. Some of them are mythological stories.
And some of them are, this person is angry with me when they're not.
Yes, it's all that. And in fact, we're actually pretty bad at it. In fact, when they actually do the studies, we're not really good at anticipating or understanding what other people are thinking. And by the way, you know, just as an aside, I just read somewhere that 70%, someone estimated, of language is not verbal. It's about body language. It's about mood. It's about intonation. It's not the words. This is why when you go online and you're chatting with people online and you say something and they completely misinterpret it because there's no nuance. They don't see your emotion. You don't. So, you know, we think that it's all about language. Well, it's about language in the greater sense, but not the verbal language per se, not the exact words and their meaning. And so now I've lost my train of thought. Oh, self and non-self. So anyway, we're lousy at figuring out what other people are thinking. We actually need all that nuance to understand. It's all about the emotion. We get a lot more information about what other people are thinking or doing or from their body language. And so just another little aside, we can identify people by face.
Easier than
thousands.
Other species.
Well,
I was thinking...
I don't know, just humans, not other animals.
Well, I was thinking, I don't know if this is the study you're referring to, but what I was thinking before you started to talk was the studies that show that, like, infants can recognize human faces better than they recognize the faces of other animals, even though they're constructed very similarly. Right. And I remember seeing this, I wish I could find it. There was a video that I saw one time online that was, they took cats and they were trying to get the cats to recognize other cats. And so what they did is they started isolating. They took, I don't know what you call it, but when they do, for example, those movies where they make a person a lot of dots and then it's like the person and then they map that.
Yes.
They did that with cats. And then they started removing dots. And they got it down to the most efficient number of dots that a cat will recognize another cat. And it was something like 8 dots moving on a screen. And when a cat sees that, they react like it's another cat.
Right.
And I was like, that's amazing that it has that aesthetic.
Here's another example of just animal recognition of form. They did a study, and this would be going, I think maybe even Conrad Lorenz, the founder of ethology. They took a silhouette of a bird flying that you would look at like this overhead. And so you can have kind of a long tail with a little bulb at the end of the tail, and then the wings are sort of on one side, on one half. And if you fly that bird this way, it looks like a swan. If you fly it the other way, it looks like a raptor of some sort.
Okay.
And then they would take chicks of various species
no.
and they would do this.
And terrorize them.
When it was the swan form, just a silhouette, where the wings were on the back half of the body, and there was a long neck and a little bulbous head, they didn't react to it. But when they moved it this way, where the wings were the front half of the body, and they had a trailing tail, they ducked down in the nest. So, I mean, there's all kinds of things. This is great about ethology. There's the example of the gulls. The gull parents have a little red dot on their beak. And when they capture food and they swallow it, and then when they take it back to the nest, the infant, the chick, pecks at that red mark on the gull, and that makes them regurgitate the food for the chick. So they did experiments where they would take various sticks or shapes that were more or less like a parent or not.
Right.
But they put that red dot on it, and they saw at what point the chick would peck at that red dot in order to try and get the food.
Right.
Or not. And pretty much that red dot was all it took. If you gave them a red dot, they're going for it. You could give them the head of a gull without the dot, and they wouldn't do anything.
It is interesting, the idea of animal aesthetics.
Well, and so a lot of people, when I talk about ritual in humans, they'll say, well, animals have rituals, and I say, absolutely. By and large, we know when an animal performs a ritual, it's for a specific function that has a specific adaptive value. There aren't, people will talk.
You talked about peacocks in, I don't know if it was in your lecture or that I saw.
It was in the book, yeah.
Okay.
But that's a popular one. So the reason they bring that up is because they say, well, when that peacock opens its feathers, sure, it's trying to get the attention of the female hen, but it's also telling the predators, here I am. And so they're saying that's not really adaptive because he's just making himself a target. So it doesn't make any sense. Some people who would argue against evolution, perhaps, would say it doesn't make any sense. But it's not, for us who care about evolution, it doesn't really matter if it makes sense or not. Peacocks are there, they're surviving, they're reproducing, they're evolutionarily successful. So clearly, that tail spread, that fan that it does to attract the female is more important for its reproductive success than the risk that it has for being eaten by a predator. And of course, this is again just a concept in all of evolution where everything is a compromise, everything is a give and take. And that's what ends up being the thing about religion as well, is our cognition is a give and take. It's like the second law of thermodynamics. I think it's the second law. Whichever one that says for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction. But this is throughout all of evolution, not just humans or peacocks. There's lots of examples we could talk about, but the point is we got this great consciousness that is a wonderful, marvelous thing. And there was an equal and opposite reaction, which the way it evolved was messy, it's ugly, it's noisy, it's not all that accurate, but it's just good enough to give us all this. And all that downside that it came with, all that baggage, we compensate for it through religious rituals. That's what happens.
The purpose of which seems to be focus on the non-conscious and at least temporary quieting of the conscious.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. And so another way to think about it, and again in evolutionary terms, is despite our big consciousness and how important we think it is, as an animal, we are still like other animals in which emotions are the primary drivers of our behavior. And that is evolutionarily adaptive.
Well, I remember reading studies on people with damage to parts of their brain that that generate emotions, and how they had difficulty making decisions, value judgments, without the capacity to emote.
Yes. And so was it Damasio's book? One of those guys talked about that fellow who got the spike driven through his brain. Is that who you're thinking?
And I did read Damasio before, so it was interesting to see your take on that. I've read him and think I did a thing on consciousness,
Yes.
just like a small presentation on it, and I remember really also liking Damasio.
Yeah. The fact is, when our emotions are damaged for whatever reason, we have problems. And because consciousness cannot replace our emotions and our unconscious processes.
And they seem to work in conjunction.
Yes.
You know, I mean, making those decisions requires the ability to value, which means having some emotional investment in things.
That's right. Everything that we look at, you know, we make these flash judgments. When you see a person, a stranger, you unconsciously make a judgment about them. It's a bias. It's a prejudice. But we're just animals. I'm sorry. It's the way it is. Now, in our culture, we make a very strong effort to suppress those biases under certain circumstances, and I'm all for it. I mean, I have this other side of me that is not biological, or at least cognitively biological, and we try and say, you know, we want to embrace all kinds of people and not judge them based on the way they look. It's a marvelous thing. It's actually quite remarkable, considering how we've evolved to have xenophobia, to be fearful of the other. And one of the ways we're fearful of the other is the way they look. Now, if you're a tribe in the Amazon or a tribe wherever, typically you have a neighboring tribe that you are having a tough time with most of the time. And sometimes you're at war with them, and sometimes you're just having a lot of tension. So for instance, in the Yanomamo, they'd sometimes have the tribes come together. But they're very nervous about that because there's all this history. And so they have a very specific ritual in the way that the visiting tribe comes in dancing and singing. And it's just they go through these processes so that they can try and reduce the amount of tension and potential conflict that can happen. Again, going off in
That's
tangents.
All right. I think it's interesting to talk about. All right, so that's pretty much the premise of what you're dealing with in your book.
Yes.
If somebody would like more information, they can, there's the book on screen, Darwin's Apple. And if you'd like, I have not gotten word that the phones have stabilized, but we could take a look at the chat room and see if there's anything going on there.
See anybody who's having an issue with what we're talking about.
So I am going to take a look and just see. Let's see. Let me see if I can scroll down and see where we're at. Well, this is kind of what we're talking about right now. Someone says, given the age of information we now live in, why do theists all over the world continue to believe despite overwhelming evidence which contradicts these beliefs? And you talked a little bit, that was from GeoSam, and you talked a little bit about that during the questions at the lecture today when someone said, addressed your comment that you wrapped with about religion not going away.
Yes. Well, the assumption is that we're rational animals. Sorry. You know, so many times I wish it was true, but it's simply not the case. We're not rational animals. We are still animals who are driven primarily by emotions at the base, but then those emotions are expressed as values and biases and all these other things. And so atheists in particular, and I am an atheist, want to believe that religion will go away. The way out of it is that you don't have to, and I also explained this in the lecture today as well. So when I talk about religion, and I say it's an individual experience, it's really spirituality. But spirituality, I believe, is the basis for everything that happens in religion. So you create your mythologies and you create your rituals. It all comes from this feeling of spirituality that people have. And it ends up continuing to evolve culturally into these institutions and their doctrine.
Okay, and just to kind of clarify for the audience, because we do a lot of times take issue with the language of spirituality on the show, but you're talking in terms of a type of spirituality which is we're actually capable of brain mapping.
Yes, that's right.
So you're not talking about some sort of mystical, ethereal, something that we can't, that's like, it's more of, that may be what it seems like to the person having the experience, but in reality, this is quite quantifiable.
Yes. So the example I give is there's a fellow named Andrew Newberg, a neuroscientist at the University of Pennsylvania, I believe. And he has done these experiments where he'll take a meditating Buddhist or praying nuns, and he scans their brains. Mm-hmm. And he finds that there's a particular area in the brain called the orientation association area, which is inhibited by these prayer practices. And what is the orientation association area? It's an area I think it's in the temporal parietal junction, somewhere here, that is responsible for the sense of one's position in space, your sense of yourself in space. If you inhibit that, what might you experience? You might experience that you drop that sense of self versus non-self to a degree where you start saying things like you feel a connectedness to all things.
The boundaries are dissolving.
The boundaries are dropping, that's right. You feel oneness. And these are all the testimonials that people tend to give when they're talking about spiritual experiences. And here we have something close to empirical evidence, and some people can take issue with it if they want. It's just one piece of evidence that goes into the whole picture that's drawn, that spiritual experiences have a basis in the brain. And that those types of feelings that you get of this oneness, of this connectedness, that goes into all of these different terms from different spiritual backgrounds, nirvana and all these things that people talk about, mysticism. There may, in fact, be a biological basis for that.
Now, you actually showed a few slides during the lecture today that illustrated different metrics that were given, like transcendence and different labels. You probably remember more of them. I remember that one specifically, but it showed that people on psilocybin hit very high levels of all of these, spiritual metrics that have to do with how people report these experiences.
Right. So, and this is getting, I hesitate to say it gets into the woo, but it's...
Well, this is self-reporting.
Yes, that's right.
Okay.
So if you're going to examine what constitutes a spiritual experience, we're sort of... we can try and do a few things where we can look at the brain scans and do some other physiological type measurements, and that should be done, absolutely. But we still need to talk to the people and ask them what they're thinking. It's beliefs, so I'm a little leery of it.
Right.
I'm not really crazy about it, but we do have language, so we can at least gather what we can gather from it.
And to be fair, like I said, people who watch this program are very much aware of the ambiguity of the term spiritual and how different that translates between people who are trying to explain it.
That's right. So I was talking about a couple specific experiments, but I'm sure there's more, where they gave psilocybin to a group of students under controlled circumstances. And again, there's a lot of debate within the community that looks at this, how well those controls worked, but they did it. And they asked the people to, they surveyed them ahead of time and got their backgrounds and their religious feelings, and had they ever done the drugs, and had they had spiritual experiences beforehand. And they tried to come up with a group of people they were pretty sure, were all very similar and hadn't had the drugs before, and that didn't have any wild spiritual experiences that they could testify to. And so some of these terms that you're talking about, I just brought it up here.
Oh, good.
The unifying vision, the abstract idea that all is one, concrete apprehension of the one as being an inner subjectivity in all things, described as life, consciousness, or a living presence, sense of objectivity, insightful illumination, and authoritativeness of ultimate reality, transcendence of space and time, which I think relates to the sense of oneness that people can get from that.
I think the other slide I was thinking of, though, actually showed labels on a graph.
Yeah, so there's this one.
Oh, that's the one.
That's the one.
Okay.
So after they go through all that, and then they survey people afterwards, and they say, for this thing called sacredness, how would you rate your feelings of sacredness? How would you rate your feelings of transcendence?
Sure.
So it's self-reporting. All right. Well, it's a little dicey. But the people who took the psilocybin, You know, and
It's
this,
off the chart. I
well,
mean, I wonder
it's
if we
very
can,
high.
I wonder
Well,
if we can show it. So could you
here, I could probably
maybe make the slide big, and we might be able to focus on it a little bit, and then we can see it on the monitor, and we could talk a little bit about it. Yeah, just set it. If you maybe set it there, okay, and maybe they can zoom on that. We'll see.
Not.
Well, we'll see.
Anyway,
if they can.
this is from a 2006 study by a fellow named Griffith, who I think is associated with Johns Hopkins. And so this is one of the charts that they got. And so you can see the tall lines are green and blue lines. Those are the people who took the psilocybin. And also, after like 14 months, they were re-interviewed. 14 months after they took it, they were re-interviewed to get a sense of if they still had the same feelings that they had before.
Yeah.
So the low red line is the controls, the people who did not take the psilocybin and they took some other drug that affected them, but not psychologically. Oh,
Right.
look at that! How nice that is.
So the little red line is people who took it was like some kind of vitamin that gives you a flush.
Actually, in this case, it was something called
You're
methotrexate.
right. That was a different
but
drug.
in a different study, they did give them niacin,
Okay.
which give them.
But
a
this had
flushing.
physical effects that would make a person think, "Ooh, I took something that's doing
Yes,
something,"
that's
but
right.
it doesn't really alter your perception.
It's not psychological,
Right.
not so much. And so this particular study showed that the people who took the psilocybin really had a perception of having very transcendent experiences and a sense of sacredness and all the various measures in affability, whatever that means.
Right. The labels themselves are actually just kind of funny. I mean,
Yeah.
it's.
So I actually want to show the next slide, if
Can you?
if I can do that. Oh, they okay, they're going to let me
Maybe-
do that. Let's see
Okay.
if I can do that. There's the next one, and they can pick it up when they want. So in this particular one, they asked the people who took the psilocybin, well, they asked everybody and said, how important was this experience to you compared to, in general, in your life,
There you go.
There we go. So the people in the black color were the ones who took the psilocybin, and it says, it's a little hard to read, but the very top one says, this was the single most important experience of my life, was taking this psilocybin. And then the very long black one it says, this is one of the top 5 experiences of my life. And then the lighter colored one, the hatched colored one, is the people who took the methotrexate, which were controls. And they have the experience was far less important to them, and it's once a week I have these kinds of important experiences. Once a month I have important experiences like the one I had when I took the methotrexate, the control that didn't have any psychological effect. Of course, on the other hand, there's a control that said it was one of his top 5 experiences, which is a little unnerving, but there's always those outliers, But the overall point here is that the vast majority of the people who took the psilocybin said it was one of the top experiences of their life. It's pretty remarkable, because they, in fact, had the experience that we call spiritual based on any number of these kinds of measures that we're trying to identify as what constitutes a spiritual experience. Tells me, as much as anything, is that the human brain is wired to be susceptible to spiritual experiences, and you just need the right stimulus to kick it off. I call the entheogens, or the newer name of the psychedelics, to be, what did I call it? Not spirituality on demand. Maybe I called it that. I forget. But anyway, consider it spirituality on demand.
Okay.
And so the fact is, we've talked about some of the other rituals that people do. Have we talked about some of the others? that can cause altered states of consciousness or even hallucinations, but they do it as in tribal contexts for ritual purposes. And so they do it with deprivations, with scourging, pain. They create pain, exhaustion. There's all kinds of ways
fasting.
to do fasting.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, we're talking a little bit about sensory deprivation.
Isolation. Yeah.
Yeah, and they did experiments some decades ago when they first thought about sensory deprivation. It was probably a CIA thing, but I don't know if that's true or not. Where they took some student volunteers and they put them under sensory deprivation. So they blindfolded them and they plugged their ears, and I don't know all the things they did to create sensory deprivation. But after a while, some hours, maybe a day or two, they started hallucinating. And it didn't bother them most of the time. They basically said that we realize we're hallucinating, and it's kind of, some people thought, oh, this is kind of cool. And others were, yeah, okay, I'm hallucinating because of the sensory deprivation. But in any case, it causes hallucinations. So what we know is that there's a number of ways that rituals that are intense and stressing can cause altered states of consciousness. And some of those hallucinatory states, some of those altered states of consciousness can lead to what we define as spiritual experiences based on some of those characteristics that we were talking about. How's that?
That's very good.
All right.
We've been handed a list of questions from the hosts that have come up on the chat room, and some of these are not, relevant to the topic today, which is fine. The show is not; it doesn't require that. So let me just see. And you should feel free to jump in, even though these are not regarding necessarily your book.
Okay.
So we have one that says, could the host, Vinny says, can the host talk about changing worldviews and what it's like changing your mindset even after consciously recognizing your previous beliefs were unreasonable? Mm-hmm. Were you ever religious, or was that never a thing for you?
I was lucky.
Okay.
It was my father who broke away from his tradition, and he basically did not have, well, he was a doctor, first of all. And I think what happened is, well, I don't know. I mean, before he even became a doctor, I presume he was starting to have these thoughts that it wasn't quite the way it was presented to him. But certainly by the time he was an adult and a doctor, he was science-based. And he would have none of that other stuff. So I didn't have to overcome anything like a lot of people do. Yeah,
and I have to say that at the point I recognized my beliefs were unreasonable, I really didn't have trouble letting go of them. It's hard to say when you don't have a caller on the line if you're interpreting a question correctly. But when I initially realized that the Bible was not a reliable source of information and not the Word of God, I left the church, and I didn't have any problem with that. I walked out and I felt fine. I had no fear of hell, or I had no doubt in my head. I was, after I read how the Bible was put together, I felt confident that this book is not anything to fear. There's nothing in it that should worry me. It's a book of stories. And so that was not a problem. Now, it didn't make me drop my belief in God. It made me drop my belief in the church and in the Bible.
That's what this person is saying.
Well, what they're saying is what was the experience of changing your mind as you started to recognize it was unreasonable?
Okay.
The way that I recognized my beliefs were unreasonable were in phases.
Yes.
So I didn't drop all of them at once, but I did drop them at the point I recognized they weren't reasonable. So as I recognized them as unreasonable, they did fall away, but they sort of fell away in parts and pieces. Don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I've got.
Well, and I have to say, people are not rational. Did I say that already?
People are not rational. I forgive you, my child.
Yeah. So, I mean, we sit here and we would like to believe that people will come around to our way of thinking, but really it's no different than anybody else. Everybody thinks their way of thinking is right. And, it's a bit presumptuous to think that our way is right and other people need to believe the way we believe.
I have to look up this verse. Someone's asking if I can explain a verse, which I am doubtful, because Ezekiel was, talk about somebody on drugs. Oh, this is a joke.
All right.
Yeah, we've got a little bit of a joke here. If anybody would like to look up Ezekiel 23:20, someone's asking for an explanation. Maybe you can help them out at the blog. So if you would like to post your explanations of Ezekiel 23:20, feel free to look that verse up and give your explanations. Let's see. So then the next question, wonder what is the opinion of the host? Oh, that's a tough one. And I'm just going to... What are the opinions of the hosts on Sam Harris? And there's a lot of controversy right now regarding Sam Harris. I don't personally follow Sam Harris. I don't listen to the podcast. I have read a couple books, and so I am completely not in that conversation. I have no informed opinion about this. I've read other people's opinions, but I am not directly getting information from Sam Harris. I have not looked up his statements, and so I can't really comment on that. I don't know if you have any opinion on this.
Well, I'm not an expert on Sam Harris either, but
Okay.
Can we group him into the rather vitriolic atheists? Is that a fair statement or no? Is that...
I think it just depends on what he's talking about. Sometimes he's actually pretty flexible when it comes to what you were calling woo. Like, there's been times when he's actually had a pretty soft take on it. But I think this is probably in regards to some accusations that have come up recently, and I just simply have no opinion because I'm too ignorant to comment on the matter. I don't
and
follow.
I am too. But all I would say is that, atheists, I've certainly met and talked to a lot of atheists who are angry about religion. I think Hitchens perhaps is an example of that, and would like it to go away and think people who are religious are idiots. Perhaps a little strong, but some people think that. And I think it's unwise to say that, because the fact is, as irrational creatures that we are, all of us are capable of having spiritual experiences. All of us are capable of touching something that can only be described as somewhat religious. It doesn't mean we believe in God, doesn't mean we have to go off to follow the church, but we can have those experiences. And I do say, and I think I've already said, humans have a brain that is wired to be capable of this, which means it's a predilection, it's a predisposition to have spirituality in us.
Well, it's like you said. I mean, if you can map it in someone's brain, that's pretty.
It's pretty
good
strong,
evidence. Yeah.
So you don't want to go bashing religious people as some of these folks do.
Okay, and that's actually, I don't want to talk too much about this, but I am giving a talk coming up in Pennsylvania in October, and one of the topics has to do with identity and how religion impacts, or conservative authoritarian religions impact identity. And so one of the things that I actually cover in that talk are the problems that people have when they come out of religion. So when you deconvert, you have this really distressing experience of looking back at what you believed and thinking, how did I believe that? And it's not just like a laugh, like, ha ha ha, that was so ridiculous, how did I believe it? It's like, holy cow, that was so messed up. How did I believe it? And this isn't just the experiences that you're talking about. This is like the whole kit and caboodle of the ideologies and accepting the mythologies as literal reality. And so one of the problems that people encounter is that it's a very isolating experience, because people who have not deconverted don't understand what it's like to have the rug pulled out from under your reality and to say, I don't know why I accepted those things. Like, I don't know why I accepted those things. I can still remember the arguments, but I don't know why they were so important and meaningful to me, or why that mattered so much. And so what happens to these people is that when they try to talk to someone about it, most of the people that they talk to, unless they've also deconverted from a very strict authoritarian conservative brainwashing type of religion, can't really understand that. And one of the things that they run into is people who are saying all people who believe religion are stupid people, or they're idiots, or they're gullible, and this doesn't help them at all.
That's right.
And so these are people who, when they have to what I think is important is for people who have that attitude to understand what goes into literally forging a person that will believe those things, and utilizing their own minds against them to get them to accept those things, and understanding this is not about an IQ level. This is about somebody whose mind was manipulated in particular ways to subvert their thinking and to subvert their capacity to question. And so they end up believing things because they don't understand that they have options for the most part. So, for example, they'll hear ideas about science that are completely not correct, but that's what the church authorities are telling them.
Sure.
And when a person thinks they know something, if I think I've been informed about something, I'm less likely to go investigate it, because I know about this evolution thing. We had classes at my church, and we went through the dating methods and how messed up they are, and so you think you know these things. And so you actually believe that a lot of people who are out there who are not religious are buying into these ridiculous scientific realities. and you know what's really going on because you've studied it at church, and the fact that you were given the information, even though it's not good information, stops you from looking it up because you feel like you're informed.
Right.
And so there's all these mechanisms in place to get people to not to accept this and not even to go out and question it because you feel like you've already gotten the information. You're told that other religious beliefs, they're given to you as distorted things. But anyway, I'm getting off track. The point is, I do think that sometimes, especially when people are making comments about their acerbic views of people who are involved in religion, they should think about people who have gotten out of it and how unnerved those people might be and what those comments mean to somebody like that.
Right.
And
also how these people are often in cases, and you know this as well as anybody, they're losing their family.
Right.
Because the family is rejecting them. They won't tolerate people who don't believe their religious views.
Right.
And so that person is, and I've certainly met those people as well. And not always through my atheist experiences, just in life. People talk about how, Mormon people. In fact, I have a gay friend who said, I asked, who's Mormon, was Mormon, and said, so was your homosexuality the thing that got you kicked out? He said, no. It was giving up on being a Mormon that got me kicked out.
Yeah.
They could live with being gay, but they can't live without you being Mormon.
And I have heard that multiple times. I'm not going to say that's always the case, but certainly it's something that you do hear.
And you can also see in these people the hurt that will always live with them, that they got kicked out of their family, essentially, because they chose not to believe what the rest of the family believed.
Yeah, and part of the talk that I'm giving deals with something called introjection, which is the opposite of projection. Like, instead of me looking at you and projecting something onto you, I take you as my mirror and I take whatever I think you're thinking about me and I assimilate that as part of who I think I am. And when you are raised in authoritarian conservative religions, you are introjected to a really high degree. You're basically told that you are that reflection of how other people see you.
Yes.
And so when a person grows up with that as their reality, what people think of them, family rejection, becomes magnified because it's not just my family rejecting me, which is horrible enough, but it's this idea that I've been trained to interpret other people's negative opinions of me as valid.
So you have no self-worth at that point.
Yeah, I don't know if it's not self-worth, but it's no self-identity. It's like all my identity comes from somewhere else. And so when those opinions are negative and I'm rejected, it's horrible.
Absolutely.
Let's see. So this one says, I want to know if you think we should approach street preachers and try to disabuse them, or do street epistemology, or just ignore them. My tendency on something like this is, when someone brings religion to you, if you feel like you would like to participate with them, go for it. They've brought it into the public sphere. They're offering the dialogue. It's not like you're intruding on someone. They've said they want this interaction. So if you feel inclined to go and interact with them and you think you can do a good job of it, do it. I actually like street epistemology. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, the Magna Bosco thing.
Yeah, but there's other people that do it as well.
Okay.
And it's just the idea of kind of asking people questions about what they believe, and you just keep drilling and see where it goes. And it's kind of an interesting thing to watch. So, I mean, I see it as you'd probably like it if you're more into the mild forms of dialogue, where it's like we're just talking and just getting to information. What do you think about this? Why do you think it? That's kind of where their heads are at. I think it's fine if you want to engage people who are willing to engage. Go for it. I do want to say we're down to just a couple minutes and remind people that we are going to dinner after the show at Star of India. And so just sort of issuing that little invitation before. Also, I'm going to preemptively thank the audience and the crew and my guest before I go on and take some more questions and we wrap. That way I know I won't forget it before we run out of time. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
It's so interesting to have you. So let's see. Somebody says something... I don't understand. Let's see. Is something wrong with people? Has he watched Robert Sapolsky's lectures on human behavioral biology?
Darn, man, I want to talk about Robert Sapolsky.
You have a minute.
All right.
But go for it.
Okay, so Robert Sapolsky had an article in the Wall Street Journal just a year ago where he said moralizing gods improve social cohesion, something like that. Moralizing gods, right? If you know Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist, has written a number of books, including The Bonobo and the Atheist. And I can't do this justice. I need my notes.
No, go for it. We can go for a few minutes if you, I mean, do you, believe me, I've dragged the show on over a minute long. If I don't give you a couple minutes over time, people will whip me with the wet noodle.
I gotta find this. This is too good.
Okay.
Let's see. Here we go. All right.
Oh, he has a slide. You have a slide for everything.
Yes, and there's Robert Sapolsky.
Okay.
So, this article in the Wall Street Journal, he says, the threat of moralizing gods may explain some of the human capacity for pro-social cooperation among strangers. In other words, having religion makes you more social, makes you more sympathetic, empathic, altruistic, perhaps. So, here we have this guy, Franz de Waal, who wrote The Bonobo and the Atheist, and he's written a number of other books. And one of his primary themes is that we inherited our morality from our primate predecessors. Things like altruism, empathy.
All the moral metrics.
All the moral metrics, all the things that go into making morality, they exist in our primate predecessors. So, given that, why do we need religion? For morality, for social cohesion, for group cooperation. So, in The Bonobo and the Atheist, if you look on the back cover, there's a number of quotes there. One is by Desmond Morris, the author of The Naked Ape, and it says it's a great book. Okay, great. So then there's this quote that says, the perpetual challenge to atheists is that moral behavior requires religion. All that prevents tsunamis of depravity is a deity or two, some nice hymns, and the threat of hellfire and damnation. De Waal shows that human morality is deeply rooted in our primate legacy, long predating the invention of that cultural gizmo called religion. This is an immensely important book by one of our most distinguished thinkers, basically just agreeing with de Waal that our morality comes from animals. It doesn't come from religion. Who wrote it? Robert Sapolsky.
Okay.
So on one hand, he says moralizing gods help social cohesion. And on the other hand, on the Bonobo and the Atheist book, he says morality came from our primate predecessors. Religion is not necessary for morality.
Could it be the case, though, that this is one of those areas where religion can serve and not necessarily that it is intended to serve? So, for example, one of the things in my family lecture when I did Religion and Family Values was I talked about how in conservative religion, they use families as tools to create adherence. But in more liberal religions, they use the religion as a tool to create family bonds. They go to do picnics, they go to do, so they sort of use the religious structure, the social religious structure, as a way to make the family bond better. And religion is the tool. But when you get into the conservative and the more authoritarian religions, they actually make the families tools to serve the religious agendas. So what I'm wondering is, do you think it's, and you've read obviously more of this, I'm not even familiar with it, but just in response to the two quotes, is it possible that a person could be saying that sometimes religion does serve using a God that reinforces these pre-existing moral metrics to then help assimilate them into that social memory?
Well, you're right. Along the way, in this talk, I may not have said everything lined up properly. Religion helps social cohesion. It improves group cooperation, there's no doubt. And it also affects the existential anxieties. I mean, religion does all these things that people attribute to it, but that's not why we have religion.
Right, I understand what you're saying.
So there's an interesting question of why we need religion to help us with our morality. But the morality comes first. We inherited it genetically.
Well, I mean, is it fair to say, though, that those moral metrics do pre-exist, but that morality itself, as far as the social structure, which is where it matters, I mean, morality with an individual is not really important until you have another individual, and then you start having social interaction. That's when morality comes into play. So if you have these moral metrics, there still has to be some shaping of them, which is why we see so many different moral codes that pop up in all these different cultures, even though we're all the same animal.
Right. And so what I talked about was that the way we should look at it is back to the hunter-gatherer tribal groups. That is where religion got started. And so when you think about those structures, again, we sort of touched on it a little bit. They're living in 20 to 150 people, and those can often be very fluid. But you need that group to survive in a harsh environment.
Sure.
And more than the harsh environment, that environment includes your neighbor humans, who are the ones you have to fear most, more than anything else. And so there are very strong moral compunctions and mythologies and all the various things that we learn that identify us to that tribe. And when we think in terms of tribes, we're not thinking in terms of, that's a stupid story and I'm going to bail out and I'm not going to buy any of that stuff. You don't do that when you're in a tribe. Or if you did, you were taking a big risk that you weren't going to make it because you were going to go over to the other tribe maybe, and then they may or may not accept you. Chances are they wouldn't.
Right, because look how you just treated your last tribe.
Well, not just because of that. They don't know, but they basically say, there's that great scene from Lawrence of Arabia, one of my favorite movies, where Lawrence shows up in they've just given him the native dress, and he's trying it out. He's walking around like this with the whole, whatever it's called, right?
Sure.
And he's overseen by the guy who happens to be the head of the neighboring tribe and his son. And the guy comes down and says to his son, "Who is this?" And the son goes, "He's English. What tribe is he wearing?" And he names the tribe. But these are the things that people recognize, because this is how we are designed, how we're formed, and this is part of where the xenophobia is built in. You recognize the way people look, not only just to recognize their face, but every tribe has its own little marks to differentiate themselves from the other tribe, because it matters, because you need to identify with your tribe and your marks and the way you wear stuff.
Sure.
And but this is also about xenophobia, and so people have inherited this tendency to be afraid of the other culture and to look for reasons not to like them, because you recognize these kinds of markings and these facial features or scarification or whatever it is. That's how you're raised. And so this is what we've inherited and what we're trying to deal with today in society, and this is why people want to know why we're dealing with what we're dealing with today.
Right.
This has a lot to do with it.
Right. You can't just separate that out from history.
Yeah, and people continue, you and I sit here and we go, how can people believe this stuff? How can they, continue to hate other people based on generalities and vague ideas of belief? Yet there it is.
Yeah, and somebody actually asked a real quick question. I think this may be the last one we're hitting. I'll scan real quickly. And I'm going to ask the people that we didn't get to. If you asked questions we didn't get to them, you should go to the blog and just post them there, and you will get tons of great feedback from other viewers. You might even get feedback from the hosts. But somebody did ask, if we would take religion out of the picture, would it be a good idea to create a secular codex that would explain the basics of humanism and morals for homeschool and education?
In my final chapter, I talk about the consequence of what I'm saying. And saying that I believe ritual and spirituality is a necessary component of human behavior. But you have to be careful, because the society we live in now is not like tribal societies. And there are charlatans, and there are people who would manipulate you for their own aggrandizement. And that you have to think about how it is you want to have the experience of spirituality and ritual. And you should have those experiences, but you have to be careful. So the bottom line is, if someone asks you to give up too much to participate in the ritual and have the spirituality, look out. But if they embrace you and they say we're all in it together and it's a sharing thing, and they're not asking for money more than maybe a few bucks just to pay for the room, reasonable stuff. They're not asking you for $1,000.
Right.
And they're not asking you to believe this thing or that thing. And they're saying we're just going to embrace, and we can all bring our own vision of it together, and we can have our ritual, and we can try and practice and have some spirituality. That's where you want to go.
It kind of reminds me a little bit, are you familiar with Sunday Assembly?
Yes, I am, and I spoke to Oasis this morning
Okay.
of Austin, which is a lot like Sunday Assembly.
All right.
And I've spoken to a Sunday Assembly before as well.
Okay.
And so when I speak to Sunday Assembly or Oasis, it's about the biology of ritual, because that's what they're doing, is they're creating ritual.
Well, the UU churches as well, right?
That's right.
They're very similar.
Speak to a Universal Unitarian once, church.
Yeah.
I've tried to speak to more, but then they look at what the book's about, and they're going, I just don't think you're a good fit.
Oh, that's too bad.
Well, yes, it's so much depends on the particular people within that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. I'm going to go ahead then. We are 10 minutes after, and so we're due for dinner at the Indian restaurant. I want to thank again the audience. Thank you for the crew who's here every single week. Thank you to my amazing guest, Mitchell Diamond.
Thank you.
And thank you to the audience. I hope you guys enjoyed the show. And sorry for the phone snafus, but hopefully it was a great week to have a guest.
We're done.
This is Russell Glasser, host of The Atheist Experience. You know, The Atheist Experience is made possible by volunteers and the generous support of viewers like you. If the promotion of positive atheist culture and separation of church and state are values that you hold, please consider contributing by becoming an ACA member or visiting our product page at evolvefish.com under the Partner tab. Thank you.